Chapter 7. One trouble with the war was that we had no medicines. We'd had the basic odds and ends, but we'd used them up pretty quickly. Now we were down to half a packet of Band-Aids and a bottle of Alka-Seltzer. And after that terrible trudge across the plains, we were tired, depressed, and wet to the skin, hair soaked and boots full of water. We were cases straight out of a medical textbook, in perfect shape to get sick. We got sick. Robin, Kevin, Fee and I all went down without a murmur. That left Homer and Lee, and they weren't too good themselves. We started off with colds, sneezing and dripping. Then we got coughs. Then we got in serious trouble. We didn't have a thermometer, but it didn't matter. You don't always need a smoke alarm to know your house is on fire. One look at the 2 red spots in Fee's white cheeks was enough. We burned, we shook, we panted, we tossed and turned. I hallucinated so strongly that they had to tie me down. I thought it was the great pruner or something. I knew that I held a giant pair of clippers, and my job was to go from poplar tree to poplar tree, cutting them into shape. Each tree was okay near the ground, but it was the high bits that were the problem. I constantly had to stand on tiptoes or even jump with arms outstretched to grab the branches with the shears and haul them down. More and more, I realized that the bits to be trimmed were like people. Some were beautifully sculpted human forms. It was not very pleasant cutting them in half, but I knew it was my duty, so I forced myself. Then they would distract me by turning into real people, and I'd watch them for a while before going back to the trees. It was during the times that I was being the great pruner that Homer and Lee had the most trouble with me. They said it was like watching a sort of mad aerobics, with me leaping up and down, grabbing at nothing, then struggling and whimpering when they tried to wrestle me back to bed. They had so little energy themselves that they had to go find some rope and tie me up. I bet that was your idea, I said to Homer. I didn't enjoy it, you know. Sure. I have to admit, the 2 boys were great nurses. I'd wake, burning with fever, and they'd be there within a minute, whether it was 3 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Not that I had any idea of time. Maybe antibiotics would have cleaned us all up in 24 hours, probably, but we didn't have them, so we suffered, and our bodies had to do the healing themselves. With a little help from the 2 boys, they wiped us down with cool damp towels, made us drink, and even eat a couple of times. Kept warm clothes on us, talked to us, soothed our fevered brows. One day I woke feeling weak as paper tissue, but perfectly clear-headed. I knew it was early in the morning, and I had a vague memory of a moment during the night where I'd felt the fight go out of my body. It had been followed by a kind of sweet peacefulness, and after it I'd slept soundly and warmly. Homer came in holding a billy and a water bottle, and I looked at him lazily. "What's it outside? Oh, you're back in the land of the living, are you? I don't feel too bad." "Good. How are the others?" "Fee's been up and up since yesterday. She's out the back having breakfast with Lee. Robin and Kevin are still just as crook." I glanced across to their beds. They certainly didn't look well. Both were asleep, but Kevin was mumbling and moving around, and Robin looked horribly white. God, did I look like that? Worse. How long has this been going on? 4 days. Oh yeah. I swear, Lee and I have had about an hour's sleep in the last 4 days. I was silent for once. I was deeply impressed by the fact that my life could lose 4 days without my having any awareness of it. Maybe this was a preview of death, continuous visions and dreams and vague glimpses of reality. Only with death, you never wake. You never wake up. You keep having the weird images forever. I thought a lot about death and what it might be like. Of course, I still do. When I tried to get up, I realized it was not such a good idea. My limbs had no strength, and my mind had no strength to force my limbs to obey. That was unusual for me, but I was too tired to care. I went back to sleep. Next time I woke, it was the next day. I was even more astonished by that. In fact, it took Homer and Fee half an hour to convince me I'd had enough of bed. Besides, I was busting for a leak, and was enormously hungry. I staggered outside and relieved myself, then got some biscuits, and for the first time in nearly a week, started taking an interest in my surroundings. We were close to the coast now. I could smell it. I guessed that by the route we'd taken we were probably about 20 k's from Cobbler's Bay. Sometime we'd have to start thinking seriously about Cobbler's Bay again. The thought almost gave me an immediately relapse into fever. It was still in quite clear country, but nothing like the plains we'd crossed 5 nights before. The grass was warrior, and the trees had wind-swept, desolate look. There were no dwellings in sight, but a line of trees 50 metres away indicated a road. The rain had gone, but it was a cold day with a fresh wind. A few clouds scudded across the sky like they were in a hurry to get somewhere. I went back into the silo and helped Lee to do a bit of housework. Well, silo work, really. "Where's the water supply?" I asked him, picking up an armful of empty water bottles. "I'll show you." He looked tired and nervous, no wonder, with the work Homer and he had done. We went across to the road and walked for a few hundred metres. I felt strange walking along so openly in broad daylight. "Don't any cars come along here?" 4 in 5 days. There's plenty of cover. You can hear them coming." "How are you feeling?" I asked, but I didn't care very much. I was too tired, too feeble, and perhaps still too sick about what had happened back at the well. "Okay, just totally stuffed by nursing you guys. Have a sleep when we get back. Fee and I can take over and give you a break." "Yeah, thanks. I think I will." I realised quite suddenly, with a sense of shock, that my relationship with Lee was over. I felt nothing for him anymore. He felt like a stranger, and this seemed like the kind of polite conversation you have with strangers. Although I didn't admit it to myself then, I think, looking back, that part of the reason was the killing of the soldier when we rescued Ken. It wasn't the first time we'd killed, of course. It wasn't the first time Lee had killed in cold blood, but this time it had been too horrible, too disgusting. I didn't want to touch Lee, didn't even especially want to talk to him, even. I felt sick every time his long fingers touched me. It's unfair, I know that. It's like making Lee do our dirty work and then blaming him when he does. But fair and unfair is for the mind. Emotions don't know anything about fair and unfair. We filled the bottles at a wide, shallow river, squatting in the gravel and watching the little gurgles as the water rushed in. It was cold though, and the bottles were cold in our hands when we carried them back. By that evening, Kevin was through the worst of it, and Robin was sensible enough to understand what was going on. The silo smelt terrible, with the stench of us humans having lived in it for nearly a week. There were 3 concrete silos in a row and 2 steel ones. I checked out the other 2 concrete ones, thinking we could maybe move into one of them for some fresh air, but they both had a strong smell of chemicals, probably pesticides. The steel ones had a nice smell of dry grain, but they would have been uncomfortable to live in. I went back to our silo. The first room wasn't too bad. The manager must have used it as his office, where you could peer down through the wire grill into a deep hole and watch the grain slowly filling it. There was a filing cabinet and a desk and a chair where Homer and Lee had spent a lot of time playing cards. There was another room where we sickies had slept, in some little concrete cells like a medieval convent. I sat at the desk and played patience for a while. With Kevin getting better, we finally got to have the big conversation that we'd all wanted to have. It was the next day, after breakfast, in the office. Robin moved her sleeping bag in and lay in it, watching and listening. The rest of us sitting quite comfortably around the walls, drinking cold Milo as a special treat. Homer had the chair. "So, Kevy, tell us a story," Homer said, starting the ball rolling. "Tell me a story," I sang. And Robin and Fee immediately joined in. "Tell me a story, tell me a story, tell me a story, remember what you said. You promised me, you said you would. You promised me, you said you would. Tell me a story, remember what you said." "Where do you want me to start?" Kevin asked. "At the beginning," we chorused. After horrible times, killing times, we often seem to regress like this. At that moment, I'd say we were about 7 years old. Kevin's story forced us to grow up fast again, though. It wasn't a very funny story, but it was the first detailed description we'd had in half of the had of life on the inside. Okay, I'll go right back, then. After Corey and I left you guys at Ellie's place, my God, it feels like years ago. That night, it all changed after that night. One bullet, it changed everything. He looked down into his cup without drinking from it. We got to the hospital about 2 a.m. I drove so slowly, I was scared she'd die in the back seat. And I kept looking over my shoulder to see how she was doing. She looked worse and worse. You could see the colour going out of her, but every time I sped up she'd groan. These horrible deep groans like I'd never heard before. It was bloody awful. By the time we got there, I wasn't even thinking about the war and the soldiers. It sounds dumb, but it's true. I'd half forgotten there was a war on. All I could think about was getting Corrie to a hospital and getting her treated. I drove up that main entrance with lights on full beam, the hazards on and the horn blasting, so they knew I was coming. And arriving like that, I guess they knew I wasn't a threat. They all came busting out, a nurse and a doctor, and a bloke with a trolley, and a couple of soldiers. When I saw them, I remembered there was a war on, all right. At first, it wasn't too bad. The soldiers knew there were still a few people around the district who hadn't been rounded up, so they weren't too surprised to see me. And the hospital staff were our mob, prisoners, so they were cool. The problem started when the soldiers found out Corrie had a bullet wound. The hospital staff tried to keep it secret. They pretended she'd fallen off a cliff, but the trouble was that one of the soldiers knew English and hadn't told anyone he did. I mean, he deliberately pretended he didn't know it, so he could spy on people. They talked quite openly in front of him, and that's how we got found out. Kevin paused for a moment and lifted his eyes from his Milo and gazed up at the funnel of the elevator shaft. Well, it was on for young and old then. Corrie was a bad girl, and right away they tried to frame us for blowing up the bridge. The two soldiers had me in a corner on the floor, and they were bashing me in the back with the butts of their rifles, going right for the kidneys, and finding them too. No worries, I was pissing blood for a fortnight. Every time I went to the dunny I remembered those guys, and they brought 3 sentries in from the bridge, the ones who had had the best view of you guys, and they were meant to identify us. The only thing that saved us is when they were so positive it wasn't us. Bloody lucky they were honest. That stopped the soldiers kicking me for a minute. They still weren't happy though. They were telling the doctor that Corrie had to go straight to the showground. She had to stop treating her. They were really worked up. No more, they kept screaming. They were waving their rifles around and trying to wheel the trolley outside. That bloody doctor, but she's a legend. She just said no, like, don't even ask. Don't waste my time. Stop bothering me. I don't think they knew quite what to do about her. There was a full-on tug-of-war going on over Corrie, and Corrie laying there unconscious in the middle of it. Sort of funny, if you'd been in a mood for jokes. Was her name Dr. Cressini? I asked. Kevin nodded. Yeah, that's her. Figures. I'd seen Dr. Cressini handling my father. She was pretty awesome. Young, but strong. Next thing, Kevin continued, 2 more soldiers came in. The 2 blokes who'd been there all along had turned their attention back to me, seeing they weren't getting anywhere with the doc. They had me on the floor again and were putting the boot in. The nurse was screaming at them. I'd been working on Corrie, and I was starting to black out. I was scared they were going to kill me. I told them the truth, how she was shot when we were trying to get my uncle's ferrets, but I wasn't convincing them. I had blood all over me, and I knew my nose was broken. Every time I breathed, I just seemed to breathe blood. I thought I might drown in it. I really thought I was on the way out. I glanced around me. There were 4 pale faces, all intent on Kevin's story. Kevin was looking down at his mug again. I don't know whether he realised the effect he was having. So, anyway, in came these 2 soldiers. I was hardly aware of them, but the wardsman told me all about it later. He was a bit of a wimp, and he hadn't done a thing to help me when I was getting beaten up, but he wasn't a bad bloke. So in came these 2 soldiers, and one of them was hurt, and they made the doctor leave Corrie and treat him. He had a sprained ankle, and how do you think he got it? Chasing 2 people through the bush, out at my uncle's place. That's how. Geez, I tell you, did they ever show up at the critical time? Saved my life. The doc called the 2 sentries who were giving me the 3rd degree and made the other 2 repeat their story. When they said they fired a few shots at some dark shapes in the bush, the soldiers realised what an honest, respectable person I was. We'd still been naughty, according to them, but we hadn't been sabotaging stuff, and that was the important thing. We're just the average naughty, instead of highly trained professional naughty. Naughty is one of their favourite words, bad boy and naughty boy, and that's what they were always calling me. But I tell you what, guys, if we ever get caught, don't get lagged for any of the things you've done. The bridge and the ride on Noah and getting Lee out of Wirrawee, they're still steaming about all those things. What about blowing up Turner Street? Homer asked, with just a touch of smugness. Kevin sat up. He got so excited. Was that you? Was that really you? Unbelievable. Some people said it was you, but I couldn't believe it. That must have been about a ton of TNT. How did you do that? My God, it was a hell of a bang. I thought someone had nuked Wirrawee. Whoa, I tell you, if they ever bust you for that, you're dead. Thanks a lot. But we were proud and excited by Kevin's response. It was nice to be able to boast a bit. That was one of the worst things about our isolation. We felt no one was appreciated or even noticing the battles we'd fought and the risks we'd run. Risks that made me go giddy every time I thought about them. The way Kevin went on made us feel, for a few minutes at least, like we were the Foreign Legion, the Great Berets, the Rats of Tobruk, all rolled into one. How the heck did you do it? We spent 10 minutes telling him, tripping over ourselves with corrections and contradictions, having a wonderful time being heroes, but it didn't last too long, as we had then to go on and tell him about the death of Chris. That sobered us up again fast enough. Kevin didn't seem all that shaken by it, though. I guess he was getting immune to death. So anyway, I said finally, tell us what happened to you after the hospital, and then we'll tell you the rest of our stuff. Okay, where was I up to? Getting my head beaten off my shoulders. Okay, so in the end they generously let Corrie stay in the hospital, but she had to be moved to the prisoners block, where you don't exactly get 5-star service. And that's where you guys caught up with her. Mrs. Slater told me you'd been there, and she had a good goss with you. Yeah, that's right. Well, I haven't seen her since the night I drove her in there. They wouldn't let me stay. I got chucked in the back of a station wagon and taken to the showground, feeling like a bloody mess. I was one too. We had a big family reunion, but I don't remember much of it. I got nursed there and eventually I recovered. It took about 3 weeks. It wasn't easy though. I guess my nerve had gone a bit, so I wasn't good for much for a while. The showground was getting ugly. People were so stressed. Conditions probably weren't bad at first, but they didn't stay that way for long. I don't think it was ever planned as a long-term residential centre for 1,000 people. Most of the buildings are galvanised iron, so they got very hot. The food was okay though, most of the time. Geez, there's enough food in the Wirrawee district to feed a zillion. But these buggers got lazy. They couldn't be bothered going to a lot of trouble to get 3-course meals for us. Fair enough, I suppose. But it wasn't really the food that was the problem. What was it then? Kevin searched his mind, trying to figure out what had caused the build-up of tension. It was a mixture of everything really, he said slowly. The crowding, that was terrible. Not being able to have showers, especially when we had those 35-degree days. And all those dickheads trying to tell everyone else what to do. You know, Mr. Rod, and Mr. Nelson, and Troy South, and Mrs. Olson. Geez, they drove me crazy. I suppose everyone was under stress, and that made for a lot of arguments, but some people didn't make any effort. That bloody Mr. Rod seemed like he was following me around trying to pick me. I think that's how he got his thrills. I can see why he's had 2 wives leave him. Kevin paused again and sat thinking. We all waited in silence, not liking to interrupt. No, that's not what it was, he said at last. It was the boredom. That was the worst thing. Day after day, nothing to do. Absolutely, totally nothing. People tried organising a few things, but there wasn't much that appealed to me, I guess. They got a school going, for instance, and that was good for the little kids. But for people our age, well, school didn't seem like much of a go. Then some people started classes for adults in a few things. There were cattle judging lessons, and Chinese and Indonesian. Old Doc Robbo took first aid classes. They weren't bad. No, he said, leaning back against the wall with his hands behind his head. There was only one interesting thing I learned the whole time I was there. What was that? Explosives.